Good evening, everyone. My name is Imogen Cohen, and I'm the chair for the Alumni Kring Engels. And first of all, I'm just really excited that you're all here because this is the first kind of real live people in the flesh event that we've had since COVID. And I can't think of anyone better to share that with than Zoe Strimpel, who's come here all the way from London after 2 years of delays because it was going to happen before, but we kept on having to put off because of COVID. Zoe is a historian, author, newspaper columnist, blogger, broadcaster, podcaster, with a special interest in gender identity and dating, as evinced by the title of this talk, and also by the title of two of her books, The Man Diet and What the Hell Is He Thinking, and also her monograph published by Bloomsbury, Seeking Love in Modern Britain. Zoe, I could actually just sort of enthuse at length about all the feisty, well-informed, thought-provoking things you write, but people are here to see you. So without further ado, a very warm welcome to Zoe Strimpel.
Imogen, very flattering introduction. I like the sounds of all those cast things I do, podcast, broadcast, other kinds of cast. It's a real pleasure, yes, to be here after a very sizable delay. This is a beautiful venue as well, so I'm very happy. So the talk's sort of a hybrid between the academic side of my interest in this stuff and a slightly more accessible style or approach. So obviously questions at the end, if anything sounds chewy or unclear, definitely ask about it, but hopefully it will make sense. It's a bit of a bland title, I apologize. I hope the thing will be a bit more interesting. So, Anna, 42, is a friend of mine. She is a soprano at the top of her game who travels the world constantly for work. 5 or so years ago, she ended a relationship with her partner of nearly 15 years. While he promptly got online and had relationships with a carousel of impressive, beautiful women in their 20s and 30s, and 2 years later, at 48, settled on marriage and a baby with a human rights lawyer, she was left floundering. Internet dating and apps seemed repellent to her, and she tried to hold out for real-life connection. After all, in her line of work, they are plenteous. But the years passed and nothing was happening. And so finally, this summer, while in residence at a festival in Germany, she got on Tinder, the original dating app and the first to force the digital dating era into its present state of total ubiquitous normality. Half an hour of swiping one night led her to Darius, an Iraqi Kurd working in his brother's restaurant, and 2 days later they began a passionate, satisfying affair. Back in London and feeling on a roll, she resumed swiping and is now dating a Sri Lankan sound engineer. It is a truism to say that dating apps and internet dating before them have transformed dating, and indeed they have. 10 years ago, before Tinder, Anna would never have met either of these men. And a decade or two earlier still, frictionless, casual, and often international multicultural hookups were not the norm, especially not for women. And despite birth control and abortion on demand since the 1960s, such hookups were still fraught with snags. Apps in particular represent a new era, the first in mediated dating's history of destigmatized economies of scale of possible people to meet. But if the internet has enabled the reinvention of norms and practices in searching for a partner, what I want to explore today is the way in which digital dating might be slotted into a longer history of technology and sexual culture, attached just as much to the past as to the present. Seeing Tinder and its ilk in this longer spectrum allows us to both evaluate contemporary dating culture with greater sanguinity and offers new purchase on the late 20th century Western landscape of sex and gender. Contemporary digital dating has attracted extreme analyses. To Nancy Jo Sales, an editor and writing at Vanity Fair, its web app form constitutes dating apocalypse. Other commentators, such as Michael Norton, a psychologist at Harvard Business School, have called our era one of the first times in human history there was some innovation in, quote, one of the biggest problems that humans face. But the assumption of total rupture on a social level hides how methods of matching have constantly interacted with social and gender dynamics, both new and old. Indeed, keeping the internet era distinct from what came before conceals important sites of continuity in the transition from older technologies and practices of dating to more recent ones. So now to open up this pre-digital history, I'm going to offer 2, not 3, snapshots. It's going to be 2 for the price of 1, not 3 for the price of 1, of pre-internet but computer-mediated matchmaking, because I wanted to keep them sort of technological. So computer dating and bulletin board messaging. So first, computer dating. Right, it's summer 1967 in the Catskills, New York State. Thousands of singles, mostly Jewish and from New York City, have descended on Grossinger's, the glatt kosher resort in the town of Liberty. The resort, whose final buildings were demolished in 2018, was so big in its heyday that it had its own airstrip and post office. I don't know if anyone's seen The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, but there's quite a lot of action in the Catskills in that. The singles are in the mountains for Singles Week, first launched in 1962 and an irresistible draw to the thousands desperate to mix and meet in the hopes of finding a bashert. It costs $40 a day, which is $312 in today's money. For all the golf and tennis and swimming and drinks and ballroom orchestras, or perhaps because of them, Singles Week was a slog. Those arriving at Grossinger's had to wait in several-hour queues to register alphabetically. Then there were more lines to get to the bellhop, and then to get books with dining tickets. Then there was the experience, grueling and dispiriting for the majority of women who formed the clientele as they competed for the small numbers of men, about 1 for every 2 to 3 women. Some, like this 40-year-old divorced woman, approached it with determined pragmatism. She said, "I come here because it's sort of like a department store sale. A lot of potential mates you find are a little shop-worn or damaged, but there are a lot of bargains too. It all depends on luck and getting on the counter first. I hate it, but what are you going to do?" There was one ray of light, one nexus of excitement and promise amid all the waiting and watching and yearning and scoping, and that was the computer. As a special bonus tie-in that year, on booking a place, guests were offered a 110-item questionnaire from a computer dating company. The questionnaire, prepared, quote, under the supervision of Harvard University psychologists, according to the firm, would then be fed into its giant mainframe, which would then spit back out a list of options. Attendees could then choose which options they liked the look of and send them dategrams by internal post. Those with a matching gram might get to skip all further watching, waiting, and yearning. But for this sea of singles ready to mingle, the computer was a force field of attraction, as strong as the hunkiest man could possibly be, and maybe even stronger. On a sunny morning at the start of Singles Week, hundreds of Grossinger's guests shunned tennis and swimming and instead opted to huddle in a basement nightclub listening to a lecture by Stephen Milgram, the computer expert and president of the computer dating firm. One 35-year-old Manhattan woman had lost her computer list of possible dates and was in floods of tears, asking that the resort's rubbish bins be searched, in turn for the missing list. Mr. Milgram assured her that a duplicate was retrievable. One of the elements of the women's affection for the dating computer, in Milgram's view, was that it acted as a kind of impartial feminist, telling them, quote, "It's all right to do things they wouldn't normally have the courage to do. For instance, the computer tells girls it's all right for them to leave notes asking boys on their lists for dates. Everyone's socially insecure, and this is a prop." In the end, the computer, its questionnaires with the Harvard psychologists, and all the dategrams in the world weren't enough to turn reality into fairy tale, and most were to leave Grossinger's as they arrived, but hopeful that maybe next time the Great God Computer, as it was called in a viral Look magazine piece of 1966, would come up trumps and spit out their Prince Charming. Computer dating was not internet dating's only ancestor, but with its use of a program, a machine, and standardized user input, it was an important one. The development of computer dating coincided with the expansion of commercial computing in the 1960s and the ability of smaller firms to buy and operate machines designed for their use, such as the basic IBM System 3. The early 1960s marked a new age of fascination with computers and reliance on them. In 1963, Britain's Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, addressed the Labour Party and warned that Luddism was not an option. The computer, already cutting a fast-growing swathe, had begun to roll down the infinite slope of the future, picking up lightning speed. As Wilson pointed out, computers had reached the point where they command facilities of memory and of judgment far beyond the capacity of any human being or group of human beings who have ever lived. Wilson marshaled the computer's dazzling attributes to plan a new industrial strategy for Britain. Others saw its potential for crunching the personal information of the lonely-hearted, or more accurately, saw a rosy future in selling that potential. The first commercial computer dating firm in the world was Britain's Compat, short for well, not short for, but an amalgam of compatibility, run by a woman called Joan Ball. Though it was Operation Match in the US and Dateline in the UK, founded in 1965 and 66 respectively, that were destined to become the storied exemplars of their kind. I want to just briefly trace the reception of these two firms to help illuminate how computer dating carved its way into popular discourse, laying in place the tropes of science versus serendipity and gendered liberation versus entrenched sexism that would go on to shape the development of internet dating right through to the app culture of today. From the start, Operation Match had the right ingredients to make it a subject of national preoccupation: entrepreneurial Harvard undergraduates, intercollegiate romance, and the daring use of a brave new technology. And like Facebook and Tinder half a century or so later, Operation Match began life on the college campus, on some college campuses. And unleashed on a college campus rather than in respectability-constrained early 1960s England, as Compat was, Operation Match was able to market itself as a flag bearer of the burgeoning sexual revolution, rather than a product of the dreary reality of social alienation. The Harvard Crimson reported on Operation Match in 1965, describing its founders as, quote, plotting since last spring to overthrow a whole way of life. Their banner reads sex, their creed is written on the circuits of a computer, and their initial organized uprising is called Operation Match. Unlike Joan Ball's Compat, which matched people serious about marriage, Operation Match grew out of the difficulties faced by its founders in finding a date for dances and socials, a problem for all college students at the largely single-sex colleges of 1960s Northeastern America. Although some who met through its service did go on to marry, the goal was far closer to the ethos of Tinder. According to Tar, this was to have some fun and to meet some attractive ladies. Tar and Co. began coming up with questionnaires for customers. There are 135 questions, including, is extensive sexual activity in preparation for marriage part of growing up? Do you believe in God who answers your prayers? There were situational questions such as, what would you do if your roommate set you up with an embarrassingly unattractive date for a big dance? There was a question about preferred bra size for a date, though this one was discarded before the service went live. Trying to see the clock, just make sure I'm doing okay. The questionnaire responses were transferred to punch cards that were then fed into the computer, an IBM 1401, accessible to the crew only between 2 and 4 a.m. on Sundays, resulting in wait times of 6 weeks for customers. Anyone at college in the Northeast could sign up, and it cost $3 per sheet of names and numbers. Some did well out of it. One woman at Vassar in New York State got 100 matches, including her female roommate. It is not clear exactly what constituted a match, just how the punch card data from the questionnaires was interpreted by the program remained deliberately obscure. The reality was that just like dating apps, computer dating was about more dates, not better dates. After a year or two, Operation Match's founders' attention wandered, and their business began to break down. But its discursive legacy was decisive. That 1966 Look magazine article had understood that what would draw readers as much as the novelty of the method and its outcomes was the majesty and secretive wisdom of the computer itself, especially when that quality was merged with an impression of sex and youth. Jean Shalit, the author of the Look article, went down to Harvard to investigate the campus matching service. In the very first paragraph of his high-octane article, he drew attention to the mystical, sexy great god computer, which sent the word, fate, destiny, go, 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 call it dating, call it mating. It flashed out of the minds of Harvard undergraduates who plotted Operation Match, the dig-it dating system that ties up college couples with magnetic tape. Between his computer-deifying opening and similarly poetic wry close, Shalit included testimony from a range of college students who had used the service, including women who perceived that for all the questions and mechanized ingenuity, unequal gender dynamics threatened the whole project. Guys are just out for a good time, but I don't know any girl who goes on a date without marriage crossing her mind, noted one. When college kids are together, the girl thinks, I wonder what it'd be like to be married to this fellow. And the boy thinks, I wonder what it would be like to sleep with this girl. However short-lived Operation Match, the article confirmed that an era of computer dating in the US was underway. Shalit had drawn attention to rival company Contact, based at neighboring MIT, which boasted use of a superior Honeywell 200 and better, more psychologically revealing questionnaires. By 1970, the big American cities had over a dozen computer dating firms each. So now moving to Dateline. In the UK, computer dating continued in Compat's groove. British universities were mixed, and unlike in America, alcohol was plentiful and legal for over 18s. The target market for computer daters, therefore, was slightly older, though still young, and without the upper-class connotations of college. Firms, therefore, had a less sexy, ebullient feel than Operation Match and its ilk. If in the US hundreds of firms proliferated in the wake of Operation Match, in the UK the market eventually consolidated into one big player, Dateline. Dateline was founded in London in 1966 by John Patterson, an alcoholic entrepreneur, using an enormous IBM following a trip to the US where he had observed the workings of Operation Match. By the 1970s, that's what the computers look like. By the 1970s, just to note, the slides are minimal because I always find that if you have lots of slides, people pay attention to the slides and don't hear what you're saying. But also, it's surprisingly hard to find satisfying visuals of anything history of technology. There are some, but it's scraping the barrel. So that's why we're going with simplicity here. So by the 1970s, Dateline would obliterate most of its competition and go on to become Britain's longest-lasting national computer dating service, surviving until the late 1990s when the internet killed it off. Like Operation Match, Dateline issued questionnaires, written, it claimed, by psychological experts, with a series of scientifically validated boxes to be ticked relating to personal traits and desires in a partner. The filled-in forms would be entered into the computer, which had been programmed according to a now unknown matching algorithm. For a fee between £10 and £50, the computer would spit out 6 names. I always find that funny, the spit out. That's what all old big computers used to do, is take things in and spit things out, literally. And I kind of vaguely remember it from my 1980s youth. So it would spit out 6 names, addresses, and numbers that were apparently encoded with similar desires and information. The company pitched itself as a novel intervention. Distanced from the mire of lonely hearts and the tricks of human matchmakers, Dateline proposed itself as a modern solution to a modern situation. As it consolidated its market lead with advertising campaigns that plugged into contemporary concerns about modernity, romance, and, quote, the predicament of the urban young with mothers and fathers washed out of their lives, it did seem increasingly able to provide an alternative to the laughable, sometimes dangerous services of both cultural imagination and news report, i.e., unscrupulous matchmakers of various kinds. "Let Dateline banish boredom from your life," ran one of its smaller and punchier print adverts. But in an age of crippling stigma associated with mediated dating and uncertainty about whether the use of computers made it better or worse, the question of who it was serving and how was of pressing importance. From a marketing point of view, Dateline was keen to harvest the success stories of its younger customers, those who wanted and found marriage, and those who were looking for nothing serious. Graham, a 27-year-old bus conductor, joined Dateline because, quote, before his marriage to Catherine, 23, who was a Dateline match, he used to meet all his girlfriends in discos, and their needs just weren't compatible with his own. Catherine, his bride, was a shorthand typist and shy, so she wasn't getting out much. Dateline was therefore a good idea. But although Dateline frequently underlined its respectability and its necessity in a society in which old courtship cultures had dissolved, it also wanted to show it had a pragmatic relationship to the permissive society. Thus, we meet Jennifer, a bubbly 23-year-old civil servant from Birmingham who effervesced all over the place, had met dozens of Dateliners, and wanted to make the most of being single by meeting as many new people as possible with no serious thoughts in mind, which is quite radical. Mediated dating had always been associated with the alienation of modernity and urban isolation, of being alone together, as the MIT sociologist Sherry Turkle puts it. But computer dating was the first technology of matching that laid bare, or appeared to, the possible coexistence of a supposedly rational or mechanical approach with sentimental aims. It asked users to square their belief in science, which became shorthand for use of the computer, with their most personal desires. In the pre-internet age, relatively few people sought love through technology. So the question of whether algorithmic matching based on user preferences, such as that offered by computer dating firms, was a good deal or a bad deal, conducive to finding love or useless, affected relatively few. But as the internet percolated throughout the landscape of intimacy, eventually coming to structure it, the tension between machine and feeling, computation and the soul, became almost universally appreciated. Can you game love with numbers and probabilities? The success of online dating and the ultimate domination of the quick-fire, high-volume world of apps suggests that it is now widely assumed that you can, or at least that it is prudent to try. Once outlandish consumer pioneers like Amy Webb, the author of the highly acclaimed book Data, A Love Story, which is a gauche account of her data-collecting, spreadsheet-tastic use of JDate to find a husband, helped normalize the paradigm. Computer dating provided the discursive petri dish for the tension between outcomes produced by machine and those that satisfied the heart. Of course, the underlying question of how the self-conscious rationality and efficiency of modernity affected the intimate sphere was not new. Indeed, as the sociologist Eva Illouz has argued, scientific modes of explanation of love came to dominate Western culture in the 20th century, a development foreseen much earlier, she claims, by the likes of Edmund Burke and Karl Marx. But the spirit of the rawly disinterested computer and its direct effect on the quest for partnership was new, and encouraged computer dating firms to use the heightened language of computational whiz-bangery to sell their services, while leaving outcomes up to some other set of forces. But from the start, computer dating showed greater promise than marriage bureau or introduction agencies for transcending the curious mix of dowdiness, old-fashioned starchiness, and seamy desperation that hung around the industry. All types of dating agencies, including expensive in-person matchmakers, claimed to reflect the times or to provide a refuge from their worst aspects. But Dateline's interest in doing so was especially explicit. In 1975, Patterson managed to garner coverage of a change to Dateline's questionnaire, We became increasingly aware that our old questionnaire was inadequately equipped to deal with the comparatively new issues which have resulted from the greater moral and personal freedoms afforded by the permissive society, he told The Guardian. Questions on the new questionnaire were sexually frank and morally frank, but revealed the Thatcherite Patterson's socially, but not sexually, conservative values, resulting in a reach for permissiveness that fell somewhat short. So questions then included, social values are wrong when factory workers can earn more money than doctors, and I prefer to avoid the company of homosexuals. So this is 1975. The historian of technology, Mar Hicks, has discussed the reputational damage to computer dating of the idea that, quote, women and men might meet casually for sex instead of within a social context that positioned marriage as the objective. Other forms of technology-aided dating also appeared to be fielding potentially troubling sex-oriented quests by women. Video Match, a new video dating service, had one female customer who told The Times openly of her goal to screw around. This was 1978, and the paper was horrified, obviously. Indeed, the proliferation of computer dating services tested the limits of permissiveness and particularly piqued the older generation, while concerns about sexual morality and respectability were voiced across the social register. When airline BOAC proposed a travel package to Americans involving holidays in London and introductions to British girls using computer dating, the gimmick reached national news because 2 MPs considered the suggestion immoral. Dating technologies both accentuate and subvert gender norms. When commercial matchmaking was in the hands of a human matchmaker, a respectable-seeming doyenne would decide whom one met. She replicated gender norms consciously and otherwise, bluntly telling women over a certain age to give up and go home, insisting on respectable aims, glorifying male providers, whatever their sexual pasts, and shaking their heads at women with careers. By taking the judgmental human out of the equation and replacing her with an algorithm or a program, the computer changed the terms of the game. Computer dating was a step on the way to the complex power dynamics of disembodied choice and control that would come to define dating in the late internet age. As with internet dating, computer dating offered a potentially liberatory technology, one in which women could state what they wanted with as much impunity as men. And, as Milgram put it during the Catskills Week in the 1960s, the printout of names also gave women a revolutionary nudge to make the calls themselves. If potential male dates were not sized up by eye, then neither were women. And if a woman chose to glut herself on computer dating memberships, there was no limit on how much romantic and indeed sexual action she could accrue. But there was no escaping gender, and the lag between technological and legislative change on one hand and emotional change on the other, between the universalization of pill provision in 1967 and the burgeoning awareness of living in a technological age, and the lingering sense that women ought to fulfill traditional domestic roles and not pursue sex or money. Computer dating was not exempt from men's sour grapes, therefore. Many men observing or participating in computer dating blamed society's woes, the expansion of women's field of ambition and the inability of some men to easily find dates. The two things went together in a lot of people's heads. They blamed all that on feminism. So computer dating fostered a strand of sexism in an arena that pushed men and women together in a high-stakes, sexualized fashion. But like the journalist Nancy Jo Sales wrote in Nothing Personal, her recent takedown of Tinder, Mar Hicks, who I mentioned before, has encouraged us also to see the technology itself especially bound up with patriarchal structures. A thinly veiled form of misogyny lurking under the system and its business model. The men behind computer dating firms, she argues, wanted a way to get women without actually having to spend time in women's company. The idea that it is not simply the content or dynamics of the system which produce actions and outcomes skewed away from women's interest, but the systems themselves and their creators became increasingly relevant as the dating market grew alongside the internet, culminating in the high-volume, high-turnover meat market of app culture. And I think we can debate whether patriarchy, is, A, is a fair concept, B, whether there is such thing as kind of these systems that are inscribed with it. So, but that's just sort of the way people think about it. But we can talk about that after. I think it's a really interesting thing to debate. So now on to my second snapshot, which is bulletin board messaging. So we're leaving hardware and we're edging closer in some ways to the origins and the emergence of internet dating. Does anyone in here know all about bulletin board messaging already? Okay, because it's not my deepest area of knowledge either, but I think it's interesting. So, I mean, again, technology was not that great to look at, but that's the kind of thing you might get up on your computer and begin a love story. So, in Kate Bush's 1989 song, Deeper Understanding, the singer captured the emotional atmosphere around a new kind of person, the computer addict. As the people here grow colder, I turn to my computer and spend my evenings with it like a friend, she sang. I was loading a new program I had ordered from a magazine. Are you lonely? Are you lost? The voice console is a must. I press execute. The song soars through the crying cadences of loneliness, capturing the increasingly intense relationship between a computer owner and their machine. The song was penned at the end of the first decade in which personal computers became widely available in Europe and the US. These computers were used for games, word processing, and, when linked together through phone lines, to access early forms of internet-style networks. The crux of these networks, where would-be lovers were concerned, were bulletin board messaging groups. This was the social big bang of the pre-internet computer period, and alongside the expected results of a system heavily used by men over women, it also offered an atypical set of gender dynamics. It was through BBM networks that users, united by special interests, could chat. And where there's chat, there's love. And so was born the first phase of internet dating, or more accurately, in a pre-World Wide Web world, the internet-style dating of the 1980s and 1990s. Unlike the dating sites of the Web 2.0 period of the mid-90s and after, these early digital spaces were laissez-faire and unregulated. Chats developed organically, leading to lengthy epistolary relationships as the joys of keyboard communication were discovered. These special interest groups were key for the computerized romance of the pre-internet period. So BBMs were essentially switchboards in the owner's homes, accessed by other people dialing a special telephone number that would allow them to leave a message and obtain one left by another owner. The first one appeared in 1978 in Chicago. The following decade saw the number of BBMs expand to 65,000 worldwide. Despite their male skew, BBMs fostered courtship, either explicitly through dedicated Lonely Hearts groups or organically through shared interest boards. With their unbounded cross-border chat between fellow computer owners, they were the essence of early internet activity. By 1986, 67 couples who met on The Source, a network with about 70,000 subscribers, had become engaged or married. Still not that many, but it was remarked upon at the time as being quite interesting. There was a lesson here for future dating services. Creating the conditions rather than a niche for romance worked better. And this is, people always ask me like about advice or what and it's not my personal, I can't give personal advice, but it's this kind of thing is actually very true. So if anyone ever tries to lure you into going to like a specialized matchmaker for people who like this or like that, I would say that's not going to work for you, and you should always stick to the kind of big network effects, the conditions, rather than the niche. So thus it was in the free-ranging, hobbyist, slightly eccentric atmosphere of the bulletin boards that love among computer users in the 1980s blossomed best. In the early 1980s, LA alone had more than 200 bulletin boards, of which a dozen were dedicated to the exchange of erotic messages. All bulletin boards were possible starting points for romance among hobbyists connected by a shared love of wizardry or car maintenance, But a number of matchmaking boards also appeared, such as New York's typically irreverent-sounding M, or Mark the Martian's mixed-up matching and message machine. Maybe it's MMMMM, that's everyone, from which several marriages resulted. The first BBM service devoted to matchmaking was set up in 1984 by two young Texans, John Bode and Scott Smith. Matchmaker Electronic Pen Pal Network was known as Matchmaker. And I'm reading out these names because it's just the difference. You know, this was an early time when everything had a clunky, crap name, and they just didn't know better at that point. So that's why things were called things like Matchmaker Electronic Pen Pal Network. And we can think, you know, linguistically, we can think about what's changed. Anyway, it was known, luckily, as Matchmaker, which is a little bit, there must have been billions of matchmaking companies called Matchmaker, but this one was successful, and it was called Matchmaker. And it was clear to us that we were onto something, this Bode recalled. And they were. The Matchmaker network spread to 14 BBS in different American states, with Bode acting as a national system administrator. So non-members could browse for free for 3.5 hours, after which they were charged $50 for 100 hours, yes. Unlike the organic, random quality of other romantically inclined boards, this one foreshadowed the algorithmic modus of the next decade's internet sites by allowing people to clarify what they were looking for. Platonic self-identifiers would not be matched with romantic ones. Someone looking for pen pals only wouldn't come across someone looking for romance. In the 1990s, BBM systems faded away as the internet grew, offering far greater control and connectivity. Matchmaker weathered the storm by becoming Matchmaker.com and gained a following of 4 million registered daters, finally selling to Lycos in 2000 for a decent $44.5 million. But back to gender. So in 1992, the feminist historian Cynthia Cockburn wrote, "In matters of technological change, women are more impacted upon than impacting." More recent work by historians, both of computers and of computerized matchmaking, have reinforced this claim, while also locating sites of female agency and illuminating the cycles of feminist hope that have greeted each new development in computing. As we have seen, computer dating overturned one of the basic tenets of traditional courtship, offering a novel means for women to initiate contact with men and offering judgment-free access to sexual partners. It also reinforced regressive norms, as I have suggested, partly through the macho culture of the industry. And yet the BBM scene offered something distinct. Rather than a direct link to where we are today, I like to think of it as a parallel internet mode and an example of how the internet can foster romance at its best. Not yet bounded by the highly gendered and classed codes of dating firms like Match.com or eHarmony or whatever, men and women related in an organic way with chat, not a matchmaking algorithm or questionnaire at the core. Moreover, to even be plugged into these chat communities, both a computer owner and someone able to use a modem meant that both men and women were part of a somewhat self-selecting group of geeks. This group had distinctive qualities, captured by Gretchen McCulloch's designation of old internet people, as distinct from new internet people. Old internet people were people who went online before most of their peers and were therefore interacting with strangers. To find fellow strangers to talk to, they relied on topic-based tools, including bulletin board systems. Other such tools were Usenet, a thread-based ancestor of Reddit, Internet Relay Chat, called IRC, multi-user dungeons, MUDs, listservs, and forums. If you don't know what some of these are, that's kind of the point, notes McCulloch. Old internet people had to have a relatively high degree of technical nous. In the era known as Web 1.0, getting online at all was fairly challenging, and actually participating required even more adeptness. Coding HTML, understanding IRC commands, installing an instant messaging client or email server were all far more complicated and difficult than anything one needs to be able to get online now. And there was an egalitarianism underpinning the old internet. In her profile of its users, McCulloch describes people who are still reluctant to use friend-based networks like Facebook because for them the internet is a place to tap into a global community rather than reinforce a local one, and they prefer a decentralized, topic-based structure, as in the days of old. So as machismo reigned. So as machismo reigned in the world of top-down computer entrepreneurialism and invention, the grassroots community of early internet adopters, users of bulletin boards, listservs, and commercial networks, was radically open to anyone who could afford the gear necessary. The many women who relished such connectivity were therefore not simply sad singles, but members of a club whose very technological grounding rendered it non-traditional. Of course, however anti-establishment they were, or are, tech communities from the BBM hobbyists of the 1980s to hackers and Bitcoin traders to Redditors of today can be fiercely misogynistic. But overlaying this fact of online life has been a sense that computer people are their own group with their own needs. Gender among the BBMers of the 1980s was for a brief instant a secondary characteristic. It could be Kate Bush, not a male pop star, crooning at the plight of the alienated and computer addicted. In 1988, The Guardian ran a complex piece that both evaluated the rise of a computer subculture and the problems computer mania posed for their social and romantic lives, including married computer maniacs. It also pointed out a number of matchmaking services to have emerged from this apparently socially stunting, lonely-making culture. But rather than flagging them as a conduit to a major industry in mate-seeking, The Guardian saw them merely as a self-generated helping hand to a group stuck in a romantic no man's land. The viability of internet dating was still invisible. Too zealous membership of the computer subculture could foster addiction and isolation, but it also clearly bestowed a sense of belonging. This sense, combined with the emphasis on shared interests and unbounded, pictureless remote communication, seemed to result in women feeling pleasantly fortified entering flirtatious conversations, despite being in the stark minority of users. One woman said to the, as the New York Times said actually, many people say they like dating by computer, especially women computer buffs who find themselves outnumbered by males. I think that's 1988. Might be a bit before. Anyway. It is safer than 1983. It is safer than going to a bar, a Miss Zoldan told the paper, adding that for many people, it's a lot easier to express themselves on the computer when they're not face-to-face. Lindsay Flynn of Los Angeles observed that the type of people you meet are generally mellower and more intelligent than you'd meet in a bar. Most are professional people, and after hours of conversing on the cathode ray tube, a friendship has already been forged, so that when I meet them, I don't care what they look like, because I already like them. BBMs were conducive to a kind of laid-back garrulousness for both sexes, and the expressive possibilities for a new generation of electronic mail senders were keenly felt. Anonymity, the use of pseudonyms, and the absence of verification technology gave online chatters new freedoms, which by the 1990s had clearly brought a dark side of fraud, swindling, and crime. But the upsides were novel and clear, as people felt protected by the anonymity of a computer screen and the length of a cross-country telephone line, and aware of the fact that they're strangers and don't mind telling you how they really feel, and you do the same thing. This sense of unbounded, unmonitored play and possibility informed the internet chat rooms of singles in countries that lacked the internet dating options of the US and UK right through the 1990s. Thus, many computer-literate Irish singles used internet relay chat, which allowed for two-way virtual chats to explore their options, alt.personal being a fruitful location. IRC cost less than internet dating and offered news groups where idle chat can develop into a relationship at its own pace. These idle chats could blossom into relationships that were remarkably international, in contrast to the dominance of location-based dating that would accompany the rise of smartphones. Paul Walsh, who worked for Ireland's online IRC server, met 4 girlfriends on IRC. It turned out even better than I expected, he said. He traveled to America twice to meet 2 of the women. I also know a New Jersey girl who went to Australia and is still there, and a girl from Chicago who met a German guy, and they are engaged now, said Walsh. In 1997, this is. In the US, internet daters regularly flew to different states to meet dates. But above all this, feminism and the lexicon and ideas of the women's liberation movement hovered. Many singles looking for intimacy in the politically charged environment of the late 1970s and 1980s conceived of dating as a series of unstable economic and sexual power relations, as much as a romantic emotional bond. The question of how women should use their increasing potential for economic independence was a matter of dispute. Male singles could get particularly heated over the twin ideas that women were just after men's money and that, despite achieving equality, they still wouldn't pay their share on dates. One minute, women want the same salary for an equivalent job, the same conditions as their male counterparts, and yet when it comes to personal relationships, they are out for what they can get from men in a monetary sense, wrote one reader of this British singles magazine in a letter to the magazine in 1980. So to conclude, the pre-internet period of mediated romance was very different, especially in specifics to what we have today. Yet I think that understanding the industry and usages of late 20th century matchmaking services enriches our appreciation of the tensions that structure even the extremes of app culture today. One such familiar tension is between ideas of technological modernity and the realities of gender, women's economic and sexual status, and people's, especially men's, feelings about them. Another is between serendipity and science. Whether the customer got what they wanted or not, the period between 1970 and 2000 saw the entrenchment of the idea that it was singles' personal responsibility, emotionally, strategically, and presentationally, to find what they were looking for. As the thickening tide of dating manuals in the 1980s and 1990s made clear, dating technologies could make it possible for singles to search, but it was up to them how successfully they did so. Still, the sense that a more effortless romantic fate was out there somewhere did hover over the process. Then, as now, the mystery of the balance between pragmatism and destiny, and between gender equality and tenacious romantic narratives, remains unresolved. Thank you. So, it would be great if there are some questions. I love questions. Anything, yeah. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. I was wondering if there's more known about the algorithm so that they used to match people early on. Was it then just when they clicked the same thing, or that they selected the same responses, or how was it? What did the computer do, basically?
Well, you know, it's funny because I actually don't think it never was like a matter of public knowledge what the computer did. So what I think happened, and nobody else has really been able to access these algorithms. I think what happened is very much what happens today with, you know, websites saying they've come up with like the secret sauce that's going to match people. You know, eHarmony is like, I don't know if anyone even uses eHarmony anymore, but their entire marketing was around the secret sauce. I think it was very much the same thing. They had an algorithm, so they were like, woohoo, we have an algorithm. We know what an algorithm is. Nobody else knows what an algorithm is. But whether it actually really did sort of match in any meaningful way, I think is entirely and intentionally unclear. And based on the sort of people I interviewed who used these services for my PhD, I mean, they were not getting matched with the people that they were being promised through an algorithm to be matched. So the answer is there was nothing known of the specifics. And in keeping with the vibe of the whole dating industry, it was probably complete bullshit. Yeah.
Maybe. Do you want to use the microphone? So
I can. Thanks. Thanks for the talk. Ooh, this is loud. Have you also looked into the societal perception of these services? Because I mean, even nowadays, there are people who are totally against it, and they're like, "Well, true romance is outside of the apps and whatnot." And others who, as you said, until today have found their, I don't know, married partners for life on apps. But how did societies through time respond to these services?
Yeah, excellent question. I think it's really interesting what you mentioned about today, people becoming anti-app, because that seems to be quite a recent backlash. Because I think of the era of sort of mediated dating, a very ugly term, but you know what I mean, as sort of ending in about 2012 with Tinder, because that really was the first time there was a level of comfort or acceptance and the kind of falling away of the sense that, yeah, but we all know it's just desperate people who use it. So, but in terms of sort of a longer history of reception and perception, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So the sort of business really got going, I'd say in Europe as well as the UK and the US in the 19th century, although the first kind of matrimonial ads were even in the 17th century, but it was mainly done through print. But there was the matrimonial press, so I think at its height, the UK had like 119 matrimonial newspapers, which were just dedicated to ads. So on one hand, there was a sense that, there was a sense that it was like increasingly necessary, because there were because of economic changes, lots of people moving to these urban centers, leaving behind communities and therefore being untethered and needing help to meet people, whereas previously they would have met people in their community. So there was a sense that it was necessary, but then, but the whole thing, these matrimonial ads, the matrimonial press, classified ads in general, personal advertising, whatever you want to call it, was always seen as being like very much walking the line between complete seedy, like, is it actually just some kind of front for prostitution, or, you know, people were very worried about that, and there was sort of real respectability problem on one hand. But on the other hand, journalists have always liked, when it's a slow news day, people love to have a story about, oh, and this is the new modern thing, and, you know, so there's always been the sense that we can just write it, you know, we can flip these services into something that represents advancement in society, or at least is synonymous with modernity. But then, so it can be sort of suspicion and like, but also modernity. But the thing is, the journalists who control the discourse in general about this kind of thing never had recourse to date in that way themselves, because it's a very niche and marginal way to meet people. And that all changed in recent years because everybody's done it themselves. So there's been a completely different sort of efflorescence in the way these things are talked about. And then there was an interesting thing, I think, in the kind of 70s, 80s, and the 90s, weirdly, there was a lot of crime associated. I mean, there was always been crime, but there was sort of this rash of apparently really grisly crime against women who'd met men in these, like, dating, you know, through the matchmaking industry, usually through these personal ads. But there was tons of stuff about, like, or computer dating as well, like, you know, women being sexually, you know, threatened or just murdered. I mean, there was quite a bit of that. Or, you know, pedophiles found such and such. Oh, and there were personal ads found in their caravan or whatever it was. So yeah, it's been really seedy. That's been the perception has been, oh, interesting, just for other people, never for me, and seedy, dangerous. So yeah, it's a long answer to your question.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. I was wondering what was the effect on, because I couldn't help think about astrology and, you know, arranged marriages, but also you expanded to fortune tellers and all kind of that. Any look into what happened to those kind of activities during the development of these apps and computer dating?
It's funny you should mention that. Astrology is having such a fascinating moment right now. Like I think now, you know, on the apps and stuff, it's all like, people genuinely put it out there as a kind of consideration. And so fortune telling, I don't know what the role of fortune telling, what the relationship of fortune telling to matchmaking, but astrology, became very voguish, I suppose, alongside New Age stuff in the 70s. And so there were like special astrological matchmaking services. People wrote and thought a lot about that as a way to sort of tell if somebody was going to be compatible with them. And what I think is so interesting is the way that's come back. People are really, really into star signs now, and what that tells you about, yeah, not only who you are, but who you're going to be compatible with. But yeah.
But also
Yeah.
And also, fortune tells you'll meet a tall, mysterious man.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, so that taps into the sort of superstitious side of it, which is that serendipity, superstition meant to be destiny, whereas the sort of computer side, I suppose, is sort of in tension with that. But I think the point is that, certainly in the two things that I was looking at today, I do think some of that sense of destiny did slightly start to fall away, also because marriage lost quite the same idea as being the sort of essential go-to that you would wind up with one person. So I think people slowly began to have a more multifarious view of what someone else, there might not be just one person that you'd be looking for. You might be looking for lots of people, or you might be, obviously the rise in divorce in the 1970s suggested that you might be married to someone for 10 years, but not for 20 years or 30 years. But it's the effect of New Age ideas and astrology and fortune telling and all of that stuff is closely connected with things to do with sexual culture and like self-exploration through sex. But I think actually it's maybe more connected in that sense than to the kind of everyday act of trying to date people. But it's an interesting area. I wish I had a more concise and more concise answer for that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your fascinating speech. So, as for now, there's many people using dating apps as a way to construct their identity or to do the self-exploring. I would like to know, if it's also the case as for the past.
Well, that's a really good question. And the answer is yes. So, again, it slightly links to that previous question. In the kind of 70s and 80s, it just began, there was a whole thing of in a couple of British magazines especially, there was this thing called the self-awareness movement or the self-exploration movement, and people were using personal ads to explore themselves. That's literally how they described it, and how the ad managers who ran these quite successful outfits described it too. So I think that's a really interesting point, an important point, that people start the shift from seeing romantic relationships as a means to an end. You find someone to marry, marriage is essential for various economic and social reasons, you don't question it too much, to seeing the interplay of self and other, like the relational as a form of self-exploration and personal growth, and then the ability to use technologies or platforms to explore 10 different people at once that can all give you feedback on yourself and what you like and what you don't like, really did become quite a sort of way in which people use these services. Yeah, absolutely. Just going to keep staring and making you feel awkward until someone comes. Did I miss one? Oh, another one?
I have an eye problem, so if someone has a question, really raise your
I
hand.
Was there just another one? Yeah.
Behind you.
I already asked one.
Right
I already
behind
asked
me.
one, but
It's
Yeah,
okay.
no, ask away.
You're out of questions.
I remember being in college in the United States in the 80s, and that you'd have, instead of Facebook, you'd have, papers, and you'd see who your classmates were and things like that. This might sound like a really far-fetched question, but university is regarded as a place where you go to meet your future spouse or partner. Could you see a situation where it becomes incredibly competitive to join a dating service, not like a service in terms of dating, CEOs? Is that a realistic scenario? So you'd have you'd do extracurricular activities, so you'd be more attractive for dating, for the app, you name it. So.
Oh, I mean, I don't think, that goes back to my sense that actually anything that tries to be elite or anyone, I think, are you saying does it make you more attractive when you're on a site? Because the sites themselves, you say,
It could be so when you apply to college, you want to make sure that you might be varsity or something like that. The same thing would apply for dating.
Oh, you mean you want to make sure you seem as attractive as possible by piling up the extracurriculars? Will it get more, will people, I mean, I'm not sure why it would change so much in the future, if anything, we seem to be moving away from wanting more impressive attributes, and just the horizon seems to be limiting and congealing around like basically looks and whether you're like roughly like left or right wing, basically, and everything else seems like, you know, it seems to be more maybe a matter of temperament now. Like, are you chilled or are you intense? But the idea of sort of, you know, does anyone care if somebody plays the violin or something? Sadly, no. I mean, so no. I think it'll just get more and more like. In fact, actually, that actually does remind me. I'm sure some of you have noticed more and more people referring to like these Myers-Briggs personality types on dating. Like, I'm an LG, like N7 or whatever, and someone else is like a 2. I don't know what they are, but they're these types. And it's such a weird thing. It's like this sort of obsession with like life hacking. You can sort of hack people now. There's more interest in that. So actually, I think it's just going to be more and more almost like, there'll probably be some sort of, you're probably going to have to start uploading some of your, I don't know about, maybe not DNA, but you know, there could be, not to kind of, not in a eugenic way, but just in a sort of like, yeah, this person is like, you know, going to be my personality type. And it's actually interesting because those first dating services I talked about in the 60s, which compatibility, Operation Match's parent company was called Compatibility Research. So this obsession with like finding the perfect formula for compatibility is ongoing, and I just, as I say, none of it works. You just have to throw a lot of shit at the wall and see what sticks. So I don't think that future scenario is going to happen. Imogen, yeah?
Yeah, I've got a question, but maybe so everybody can hear at the back. I remember a while back hearing these adverts on the radio for a matchmaking service or dating app, Second Love or something. It was for people who were already married. A second, you know, and you could have, it was a matchmaking service to basically have an extramarital affair. And I wondered if you'd come across anything like that in the history of dating in your research.
I mean,
or is this really something for now?
Yeah, I mean, the famous one obviously is Ashley Madison, the American website for affairs. That's just what it was about. And I think it shut down after a massive data breach where all of its like top secret users, because obviously they didn't want everybody knowing that they were, it was actually quite sad. People killed themselves and stuff. It was a huge thing, but it was massively successful.
Where does that go back to?
That was a dating site, the hate in early 2000s. Mid 2000s? Yeah, no, but I really don't think, I think people used to go about things in a bit more of a don't ask, don't tell way, which was much better because people just thought, you know, now there's this whole complicated, exhausting thing about like defining that you're like monogamish or open, ethically ethically non-monogamous or ethically polyamorous or all these like things that all add up to like, I don't want to have to, you know, limit myself, which is fair if somebody else can accept that. But I think that there was more of a sort of, it was understood that cheating happened. You just didn't be like, that's my identity, accept it or, you know, see you later kind of thing, which is what's happening now. So I think probably, no, there was a lot, things were really like traditional until quite recently. I mean, there were like censorship laws until the 70s, I think, in the UK, and people were still being arrested for same-sex sexual activity. The police were still getting involved in the 70s in the UK. So there definitely wasn't any sort. No, I don't think I haven't come across, and I would surmise that there were not any kind of explicitly extramarital services. But it's an interesting question.
So I was wondering, it's more about recent dating services in that sense, but I had to laugh the other day because I was getting emails from Bumble because they hadn't seen me in so long. And I was kind of like, well, isn't that the point of the whole thing? And this is interrelated to, I guess, the more technical aspect of it, as all these apps nowadays are obviously collecting and mining data in big amount, of course. And I wonder if you have looked into a little bit into, or it's not really a question, more of a comment, but how that's going to affect what we see on these apps. Can we even trust them to, do they even want to make matches anymore? Or so do we have to be lucky if it actually works out? Or is it just us, all the super detail, or OkCupid? I mean, I've tried all of them. So OkCupid is the one where you can answer hundreds and hundreds of questions. Of course, I did in the beginning because I was like, oh, this is so interesting. I can find out so much about myself. And then I was like, what did I just give away freely? You know, it's out there and I cannot get it back. So this whole data versus what's the purpose of these things.
Yeah. Well, that's, I suppose, you just put your finger on the sort of whole thing that people worry about with all of these social media companies. And obviously, people are worried about data, the settings, what Facebook, what anyone gets from you. And absolutely, they are mining that, and they are using it to profit. But I'm not sure that the user has to worry about that, because the apps are basically free. So I suppose it's like that's the quid pro quo, but it's not going to wind up. I don't think that's what's going to wind up kind of like, I don't think you're being fed kind of, I don't think it results in being fed intentionally bad matches so that you have to come back. But people have definitely, that question of the business model. How does it work if people sort of are happy? But I guess the reason is that they're right to assume that as society changes in various ways, relationship times, shorten, and there is just more churn. But I think what's really interesting about what's happening with certainly Bumble, and Hinge, I think, is the way they're trying to like get in on the culture wars. Like they're trying to, like you'll swipe and then there'll be something that's like, Bumble is like standing with Black Lives Matter. If you don't sign up to this exact way and the way we do it, like you're not welcome on the site, or like the new categories that will be added on to Hinge, or that might be. I think there's a new one which was just really interesting which is to do with like thinking having children is morally wrong or something because of new kind of environmental positions and stuff. And also lots of gender stuff, and so there's this like, they're trying to, I can't figure out if they're shaping these categories, like, because there's so many millions of people using these sites, and if all these millions of people start thinking of themselves in terms of, oh, am I, a common response to what I'm saying, am I a birth striker, or am I this gender, am I that gender? Who's influencing who? Or are they responding? Or are they doing what a lot of brands are doing, which is trying to, like get in on the whole, like we stand with blah, blah, blah. What does that actually mean? Is it a dating site's job to stand with anything? Or is it just supposed to do its job, which is to kind of give us? But I've really noticed there's a sort of attempt at social and cultural puppeteering, and I think that's really interesting. And what that's about in terms of the profit, I don't know, the profit model, and whether that's just cynical branding or if it just reflects what people want, I don't know. But yeah, the data thing, I think that's it's funny, some people really mind about the data, a lot of people do, and some people don't care, and I think, I'm not quite sure why some people mind and some people don't care. I think there must be enough people who don't mind for them to keep doing it, yeah. Looks like we've squeezed every last drop of curiosity out of this crowd, so we should let them off the hook.
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of questions, really great answers. Unless there's one last question that someone's dying to ask and was too shy.
Or not dying to ask, but just can just cook up as a kind of.
Well, maybe I have a question. Oh, okay. Well, yes. Thank you for your interesting talk. Last question, because it is a question which is beside the point. That's why I didn't want to ask it or dare ask it. Do you know how it works in Japan? Because there, young people don't want any lasting relationships. They don't want to get married.
Yeah, it's one of the kind of.
Is that going to spread out, you think?
I mean, I don't know. It's a very good question. I don't know what the specifics of the dating industry are in Japan, assuming there is one. But as you say, it's yes. I mean, dating sites would struggle there because you can't even assume the basic thing that all these apps count on, which is some degree of desire, I suppose. It's a good, Japan is an interesting one, and I wonder if it's something we're heading towards in some ways. But that's a good prompt. I'm curious as to know what Tinder and Bumble are like there, and what they're looking for, because it could be that in Japan those apps exist. I'm sure they do, but there's maybe categories that we don't have, like friend or something like that you're looking for, or like shopping companion, or I don't know. But yeah, no, it's a good question. Okay.
All right, I'll pass it on. Thank you.
One last question. I was curious about the research process of the topic. You mentioned you were doing interviews as well as the kind of newspaper articles and magazines. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the kind of challenges in doing this kind of topic and the kind of archiving of sort of affects in a way in the computer-based kind of relationship.
Very, very good question. A historian's question, because the archive is definitely what we would call scrappy. So I had to take a holistic approach. And actually, I did my PhD thinking I was going to go from 1970 up to the present with 2000, sort of bisecting it all, thinking, okay, I'm going to go from pre-internet into the internet period. But I found the sort of availability of satisfying resources for the post-2000 period so not, it was not good enough. So I just, there's certain things like the Wayback Machine where you can see old sites frozen in time, but really it's not, because of, data protection or anonymity, like I couldn't go back and look at Match.com profiles from 1997 or something, so, or 2004. So I just thought it was going to be way too partial to actually look at any primary material, so I abandoned that. This stuff it's interesting. I mean, there's actually more about computer stuff than there is about early internet. I mean, it's easier to look at original materials. Well, even then, I mean, I can't say that I've looked at any punch cards or anything, although there are pictures of them. But there's more ephemera and more material, physical material associated with the computer era than the early internet era. And that's something historians and archivists are really working on. And at the British Library now, they're really, they've aggressively been archiving Twitter, and everything is kept now. So the internet for the last 10 years or so is really well kept. But before that, less so. But there's always other things you can do, and maybe I should have kept going. But as you say, oral histories, you can always interview people. It's a very basic, but looking at old newspapers always tells you interesting stuff. And then there are some really good, rich archives that I know about in the UK. I'm sure there are ones here too, but that kind of bring together, for instance, diaries. Like the Mass Observation Project is like hundreds and hundreds of people who write diaries over the course of years on different topics, and some of them are like romance. Some, these things crop up in those as well. And then I'm telling you, the Singles magazine. It was a gold mine. So that has everything in it. It goes from 1977 to 98 or whatever, and it just you get all of that. So I'm doing a project now on breakups and divorce. I'm so cheery. And I need to return to Singles because it'll be lots of angry people kind of ranting about their divorces and stuff. So there's always, but yeah, the early internet is not fun to try to research. So I avoided it. Okay.
In that case, thank you.
Oh yeah, and I am supposed to say one other thing, which is that basically if you pick up one of those, there's like little cards on the table over there, and it has a QR code on it, and you can bring it to the bookshop, and you can get a discounted price on my monograph, my book about dating in modern Britain. But you should just take one, and then I won't have to know what you do with it. Yeah. So that's it, yeah. So.
Thank you very much, Zoe. That was really great. And it's so nice to have all the questions from the audience. I think there were a lot of questions, and very diverse questions.
Yeah, I love the questions, so thank you. And very good audience, so thank you very much.
Thank you.